The rain fell in quiet sheets over the small coastal town of Haven's Edge, blurring the lines between the sea and the sky. Eleanor Grayson stood at the edge of her porch, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped ceramic mug. The coffee inside had long gone cold, much like the house behind her. She was 38, though the lines etched into her face whispered of a life that had stretched her far beyond her years. Her husband, Daniel, was supposed to be home by now. He'd texted earlier a brief, distracted message about a late meeting at the marina where he managed boat repairs. She'd believed him, as she always had. Until tonight. The first sign had come 3 weeks ago, a faint whiff of lavender on his jacket, a scent she didn't wear. Eleanor had dismissed it, chalking it up to a client or a co-worker. Daniel was charming in that effortless way, tall, with sun-bleached hair and a smile that could disarm anyone. It was what had drawn her to him 15 years ago when they'd met at a friend's bonfire, her a shy librarian and him a sailor with stories of the open water. They'd built a life together, brick by brick, a modest house, a daughter named Lily who was now 12, and a rhythm of quiet, unspoken trust. Or so she'd thought. Tonight, though, the doubt had grown teeth. She'd found the receipt in his truck while looking for a pen crumpled under the passenger seat, dated 2 nights ago. Dinner for 2 at La Mer, a restaurant in our South, with a bottle of wine and a dessert she knew he didn't like. He'd told her he'd been working late that night, fixing a yacht's engine. The lie sat heavy in her chest now, a stone she couldn't swallow. Eleanor set the mug down and pulled her cardigan tighter against the damp chill. She could hear Lily upstairs, humming to herself as she worked on a school project about constellations. The normalcy of it clawed at her. She didn't want to confront him, not yet. She wanted proof, something undeniable, because once she asked, there'd be no going back. The headlights of Daniel's truck cut through the rain as he pulled into the driveway. Eleanor stepped back into the shadows of the porch, watching as he climbed out, his shoulders hunched against the weather. He didn't notice her at first, fumbling with his keys as he approached the door. When he looked up and saw her, his face flickered surprise, then something else. Guilt, maybe. Or fear. "You're up late," he said, his voice casual but strained. He shook the rain from his hair, droplets scattering across the wooden floor as he stepped inside. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, her tone flat. She followed him into the kitchen, where he busied himself pouring a glass of water. His movements were too deliberate, like he was stalling. "How was the meeting?" "Fine. Boring, mostly. Just numbers and schedules." He didn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on the glass in his hand. "You know how it is." "Do I?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, sharp and brittle. Daniel froze, his fingers tightening around the glass. For a moment, the only sound was the rain tapping against the windows. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, turning to face her. His expression was guarded now, the easy charm gone. Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out the receipt, smoothing it onto the counter between them. "Found this in your truck. La Mer. 2 nights ago. You said you were at the marina." His eyes darted to the paper, then back to her. She watched the color drain from his face, watched him scramble for a lie she knew he couldn't find. It's not." "Don't." She cut him off, her voice trembling. "Don't lie to me again. Just tell me who she is." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling a shaky breath. "Her name's Claire," he said finally, the words dropping like stones into still water. "She works at the marina." It's been going on for a few months." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "A few months," she echoed, the enormity of it sinking in. "How many times have you come home to me to us after being with her?" "Oh, please, how many times?" Her voice cracked, raw and desperate. "I don't know," he admitted, his head bowing. "Too many." She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him feel the jagged edges of the pain tearing through her. But all she could do was stand there, staring at the man she'd loved for half her life, now a stranger wearing his face. "Why?" she whispered. Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't have a good answer. It just happened. She was there, and I was tired, and you and we've been drifting, haven't we? You're always so busy with Lily, with work." "Don't you dare blame me," Eleanor snapped, her anger flaring bright and hot. "I've been here, Daniel. I've been holding this family together while you've been what? Chasing some fantasy." "It's not a fantasy," he said quietly. "It's real. I care about her." The confession hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled back a step, her breath hitching. Do you love her? He didn't answer right away, and that was answer enough. I don't know, he said at last. I still love you, Elle. I do. But it's different with Claire. It's easier, she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. 15 years, a daughter, a home, and you throw it away because it's easier with someone else? I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, reaching for her hand. She jerked away, the touch burning like a betrayal all its own. Don't touch me, she hissed. You don't get to touch me anymore. Upstairs, Lily's humming stopped. The creak of the floorboards told Eleanor her daughter was listening now, caught in the crossfire of a war she didn't understand. She lowered her voice, but the venom remained. What happens now? Are you leaving us for her? Daniel shook his head. I don't know what I want. I just know I've messed everything up. You think? Her laugh was hollow, edged with terror she refused to let fall. Get out. I can't look at you right now. Elle, it's pouring out there. Get out. She pointed to the door, her hand trembling but resolute. He stared at her for a long moment, then grabbed his keys and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor sank to the floor, her back against the cabinets, and let the sobs come. They tore through her, jagged and relentless, until she was empty. The next morning, Lily found her there, still on the kitchen floor. Mom. Her daughter's voice was small, uncertain. Where's Dad? Eleanor looked up into her daughter's wide, trusting eyes and felt her heart break all over again. He's gone for a little while, sweetheart, she managed, pulling Lily into her arms. But we're going to be okay. I promise. She didn't know if it was true, but she'd make it true. For Lily. For herself. The rain had stopped, and through the window, the first faint light of dawn crept in, pale and fragile, like a new beginning she wasn't ready to face. The days after Daniel left blurred into a haze for Eleanor. The house felt too big, too quiet, even with Lily's soft footsteps padding through the rooms. She'd told her daughter a half-truth, that Dad needed some time away to figure things out. Lily, perceptive beyond her 12 years, didn't press for more, but her silence was heavy with questions she didn't ask. Eleanor hated that she couldn't shield her from this, that the fracture in their family had already begun to carve its mark on her daughter's world. She hadn't heard from Daniel since he'd walked out into the rain 3 nights ago. No calls, no texts, just the ghost of his absence lingering in every corner. His work boots still sat by the door, caked with mud from the marina. His favorite mug, a chipped blue thing with "World's Okayest Dad" scrawled across it, rested unwashed in the sink. She couldn't bring herself to touch them, as if moving them would make his leaving real, permanent. Eleanor spent her mornings at the library where she worked, shelving books and answering patrons' questions with a mechanical smile. The routine kept her afloat, a lifeline against the tide of her thoughts. But at night, alone in their bed, the memories came, unbidden flashes of the life they'd built together, now tainted by the shadow of Claire. She remembered the early days, when Daniel had been a sailor drifting into Haven's Edge after a storm wrecked his boat. They'd met at that bonfire, the air thick with salt and smoke, his laughter cutting through the chatter like a beacon. She'd been 23, awkward and bookish, her life mapped out in quiet chapters. He'd swept her into a story she hadn't expected: dates on the pier, late-night drives along the coast, promises whispered under a sky full of stars. "You're my anchor, Elle," he'd said once, his hands warm around hers. "I'd be lost without you." How had they drifted so far from that? She traced the years in her mind: the birth of Lily, the sleepless nights, the slow grind of bills and routine. They'd stopped talking, really talking, somewhere along the way. She'd been consumed with motherhood, with keeping their little world steady, while he'd buried himself in the marina, coming home later and later. She'd thought it was exhaustion, the weight of providing. Now she saw it for what it was: distance he'd filled with someone else. On the 4th day, she broke. She needed answers, not just for herself but for Lily, who deserved more than vague excuses. She drove to the marina under a gray, brooding sky, her hands tight on the wheel. The parking lot was half empty, the off-season leaving the docks quiet. Daniel's truck was there, parked near the office, and her stomach twisted at the sight. Inside, the air smelled of oil and salt. A young man at the counter, Tommy, one of Daniel's mechanics, looked up from a clipboard. "Hey, Mrs. Grayson," he said, his smile faltering as he registered her expression. Dan's out back with a client. Want me to get him?" "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll find him." She stepped onto the dock, the wind tugging at her coat. She heard his voice before she saw him, low, familiar, threaded with that easy charm. He was by a sleek white yacht, gesturing at the hull, and beside him stood a woman. Claire, she knew instinctively. She was younger, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled into a loose braid, her laughter bright against the dull roar of the waves. They didn't notice Eleanor at first, caught up in their shared orbit. She watched them for a moment, her chest tightening. Claire reached out, brushing Daniel's arm as she pointed at something on the boat, and he didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, intimate in its casualness, and it cut deeper than any confession. This wasn't a fling, a mistake. This was something alive, something growing while Eleanor's world crumbled. "Daniel," she called, her voice carrying over the wind. He turned, and the easy smile on his face vanished. Claire stepped back, her eyes flicking between them, uncertainty replacing her warmth. Daniel said, stepping toward her. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see it," she said, her gaze shifting to Claire. Claire shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms. "I should go," she murmured, but Eleanor held up a hand. "No. Stay. You're part of this now." She turned back to Daniel, her voice low and fierce. "I want to know everything. How it started. Why you let it go on. I deserve that much." Daniel glanced at Claire, then back at Eleanor, his shoulders slumping. "Can we do this somewhere else?" "Not here." "No," she said. "Here. Now." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It started in November. She'd just started working here, bookkeeping, mostly. We got talking one night after hours, about nothing, really. Boats, the weather. It was easy. No pressure. One thing led to another. One thing led to another," Eleanor repeated, the words hollow. "That's what you call months of lying to me? Sleeping with her while I was home with our daughter?" Claire flinched, looking away, but Daniel met her gaze. "I didn't plan it, I swear. It just happened, and then I couldn't stop it. Couldn't, or didn't want to." She shot back. "You had a choice every time you went to her. Every time you came home, and kissed me like nothing was wrong." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I screwed up. I hate myself for it." "Then why didn't you stop?" Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Why wasn't I enough?" He didn't answer, and the silence was a wound all its own. Claire spoke then, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't know about you at first." "Not really." He said, "Things were complicated at home. By the time I figured it out, I was already in too deep." Eleanor looked at her, this woman who'd slipped into her life like a thief. She was pretty, yes, but it was the confidence in her posture, the way she held herself, that struck Eleanor. She was everything Eleanor hadn't been lately: unburdened, free. "Do you love him?" she asked, echoing the question she posed to Daniel nights ago. Claire hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." The admission landed like a punch. Eleanor turned to Daniel. "And you? Do you love her?" "I don't know," he said again, the same weak refrain. "I love you, Elle. I always will." But, she cut in, "You love her too. Enough to risk everything we had." He didn't deny it, and that was the final crack in the dam. She turned and walked away, her steps unsteady on the weathered boards. Daniel called after her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now. Back home, she found Lily in the living room, surrounded by star charts and colored pencils. "Did you see Dad?" Lily asked, not looking up. "Yeah," Eleanor said, forcing a smile. "He's busy with work." Lily nodded, but her pencil paused. "Is he coming back?" The question hung in the air, sharp and fragile. Eleanor sat beside her, pulling her close. "I don't know, sweetheart. But whatever happens, we've got each other. Always." That night, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, staring into the dark. She thought of the promises Daniel had made through sickness and health, for better or worse, and how they'd crumbled under the weight of his choices. She thought of Claire, a stranger who'd claimed a piece of her life. And she thought of herself, the woman she'd been and the one she'd have to become. The phone rang, shattering the silence. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. She let it ring, her hand hovering over it, then turned it off. Tomorrow, she'd start picking up the pieces for Lily, for herself. But tonight, she let the grief take her, a storm she couldn't outrun. Claire Maddox stood on the deck of the yacht, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jacket, watching Eleanor's retreating figure disappear into the marina's office. The wind off the water stung her eyes, or maybe that was just the guilt. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had braced for it, even, but it didn't make it any easier. Eleanor's voice, sharp with pain, echoed in her mind. You're part of this now. And she was. There was no undoing that. Beside her, Daniel was silent, his gaze fixed on the spot where his wife had been. His shoulders were slumped, his hands restless at his sides. Claire wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? That she was sorry. She was, but it felt hollow now, a cheap offering against the wreckage she'd helped create. I should go after her, Daniel muttered, more to himself than to her. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if tethered by indecision. Don't, Claire said quietly. Not yet. She needs space. He turned to her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't name, anger, maybe, or despair. You don't get it, Claire. That's my wife. My family. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe you can't, she said, and the truth of it settled heavily between them. Not the way you want to. He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head and walked away, his boots thudding against the dock. Claire stayed where she was, the cold seeping into her bones. She hadn't meant to fall for him. That wasn't the plan when she'd taken the job at the marina 4 months ago, fresh off a breakup and looking for a clean slate. Haven's Edge had seemed like the perfect escape, a sleepy town where she could rebuild, far from the chaos of her old life in Portland. Daniel had been a surprise. He'd been her boss, technically, though he never acted like it. He was warm, easy to talk to, with a quiet humor that crept up on you. The first time they'd stayed late, it was over a pile of invoices and a shared pizza, the office lit by a single flickering bulb. He'd told her about sailing, about the time he'd nearly capsized off the coast of Maine, and she'd laughed until her sides ached. It had felt innocent then, a spark of connection in a life that had grown to solitary. But it hadn't stayed innocent. There'd been a night in December, rain hammering the roof, when he'd offered to drive her home after her car wouldn't start. They'd sat in his truck, the heater humming, and the air had shifted, charged with something neither of them acknowledged until he kissed her. She'd pulled back at first, startled, but then she'd leaned in, chasing the warmth of it. He'd told her about Eleanor that night. Vaguely, things are complicated at home, and she'd let herself believe it was enough, that she wasn't crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Now, standing alone on the dock, she saw it for what it was, cowardice. She'd wanted him, and she'd let that want blind her to the cost. She'd met Lily once, a bright-eyed girl who'd come by the marina with a school project, chattering about stars while Daniel beamed with pride. Claire had smiled, charmed by her, and pushed down the nagging voice that whispered, "This is his daughter, his family." She told herself it wasn't her responsibility to fix his marriage, that he was the one making choices. But she'd made choices too. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from her sister, asking how she was holding up. Claire ignored it, her thoughts drifting back to Eleanor's face, the raw hurt in her eyes. She didn't hate Claire, not yet, but she would. And maybe she should. Back at the house, Eleanor moved through the evening like a ghost. Lily was at a friend's for a sleepover, a small mercy that gave Eleanor room to breathe or fall apart, depending on the moment. She'd turned Daniel's phone call away last night, but the silence that followed was worse. It left her alone with her questions, her anger, her grief. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, the receipt from La Mer still crumpled beside her. She smoothed it out again, staring at the numbers, $82.47, a price tag on her betrayal. She wondered what they'd talked about over that meal, what had made him laugh, what had drawn him to Claire when she'd been right here, waiting. The doorbell jolted her from her thoughts. She hesitated, then crossed to the door, half expecting Daniel. Instead, it was Sarah, her oldest friend, holding a bottle of bourbon and a sympathetic smile. "Lily called me," Sarah said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Said you seemed sad. Figured you could use some company." Eleanor managed a weak laugh. "She's too smart for her own good." "She's your kid," Sarah replied, setting the bourbon on the counter. "Spill it, Elle. What's going on?" The story poured out then, halting at first, then in a rush Daniel's confession, the marina, Claire's quiet admission. Sarah listened, her face darkening with each word, until Eleanor finished, her hands trembling around the wine glass. "That bastard," Sarah said, pouring them both a shot of bourbon. 15 years, and he pulls this. "You don't deserve it, Elle. I keep thinking I should have seen it," Eleanor said, her voice small. "Maybe I pushed him away. Maybe I wasn't enough. "Don't you dare," Sarah snapped, her tone fierce. "This isn't on you. He's the one who broke his vows, not you." Eleanor nodded, but the doubt lingered. She sipped the bourbon, the burn grounding her. "I saw her today. Claire. She's different. Younger, freer. I don't know how to compete with that." "You're not competing," Sarah said. "You're Eleanor Grayson. You built a life with him, raised an amazing kid. She's just a distraction." "Maybe," Eleanor murmured, but the word felt empty. She didn't want to be the steady wife, the anchor anymore. She wanted to be wanted, the way Claire was. Sarah stayed late, filling the house with her steady presence, but when she left, the silence returned. Eleanor wandered upstairs to Lily's room, lingering by the star charts pinned to the wall. She traced Orion's belt with her finger, remembering how Daniel used to lift Lily onto his shoulders to point out the constellations. The memory ached, a reminder of what they'd lost. Her phone buzzed Daniel again. This time, she answered, her voice cold. "What do you want?" "I'm at the motel by the pier," he said, sounding tired. I needed to hear your voice." "You don't get to need me right now," she said, her anger flaring. "You made your choice." "I haven't," he said. "I'm messed up, Elle. I don't know what I'm doing. I just know I don't want to lose you." "You already have," she said, and hung up before he could respond. The tears came then, hot and relentless, and she let them fall, curling into Lily's bed among the stars. Across town, Claire sat in her small apartment, a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. She'd seen Daniel's truck at the motel on her drive home, the light in his window flickering like a signal. She hadn't stopped. She didn't know if she should. She loved him, or thought she did, but the weight of Eleanor's pain, Lily's innocence, pressed against her chest. She wasn't sure she could carry it. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Daniel. "We need to talk. Tomorrow." Then she deleted it, her thumb hovering over the screen. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight, she'd sit with the mess she'd made, the love she'd chased, and the lives she'd tangled in her own. The morning after Sarah's visit, Eleanor woke in Lily's bed, the faint scent of crayons and lavender clinging to the pillow. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the star charts on the wall. For the first time in days, she didn't feel the immediate crush of despair. It was still there, a dull ache beneath her ribs, but something else stirred to a flicker of resolve, fragile, but growing. She padded downstairs, the house quiet without Lily's chatter. Her daughter would be back from the sleepover soon, and Eleanor wanted to be ready not just to face her questions, but to start rebuilding the life they'd share, with or without Daniel. She brewed coffee, the ritual grounding her, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sea shimmer in the distance. Haven's Edge had always been her home, its rhythms woven into her bones. She wouldn't let Daniel's choices take that from her. The first step was small but deliberate. She grabbed a trash bag and began clearing out the remnants of his muddy boots by the door, the unwashed mug in the sink, the half-empty bottle of his cologne in the bathroom. Each item thudded into the bag, a quiet act of defiance. She paused at his jacket, the one that had carried the faint whiff of lavender weeks ago. Her fingers tightened around it, then she tossed it in too. She wasn't erasing him, not yet, but she was making space. Lily came home an hour later, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes searching Eleanor's face. "You okay, Mom?" she asked, dropping her bag by the couch. "Getting there," Eleanor said, mustering a smile. "How about you?" Lily shrugged, kicking off her sneakers. "It was fun. But I missed you." She hesitated, then added, "And Dad." Eleanor knelt in front of her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I miss him too, sometimes. But we're going to figure this out together, okay? Just you and me for now." Lily nodded, her lip trembling, and Eleanor pulled her into a hug. She felt the weight of her daughter's trust, the unspoken promise to protect her, and it steadied her. She couldn't control Daniel, couldn't undo the past, but she could choose what came next. That afternoon, she called the library and took a personal day. Then she drove to the hardware store, Lily in tow, and bought paint soft blue for the kitchen, a color she'd always loved but Daniel had vetoed as too bright. They spent the day rolling it onto the walls, laughing as splatters dotted their clothes. It was messy, imperfect, but it was theirs. Lily chattered about school, about a boy who'd teased her about her star charts, and Eleanor listened, letting her daughter's voice fill the cracks in her heart. By evening, the kitchen glowed with new light, the blue a quiet rebellion against the gray of the past week. They ordered pizza and ate on the floor, surrounded by paint cans and drop cloths. "It's like a fresh start," Lily said, her mouth full of pepperoni. "Yeah," Eleanor agreed, her throat tight. "It is." The next step was harder. She texted Daniel, "We need to talk. Tomorrow, here, 10 a.m. His reply came quickly, "Okay," and she set the phone down, her hands steady. She didn't know what he'd say, whether he'd choose her or Claire or neither, but she was done waiting for him to decide her future. When he arrived the next morning, he looked worn, his hair unkempt, shadows under his eyes. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, as if unsure of his welcome. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "Come in," Eleanor said, stepping aside. The kitchen smelled of paint and coffee, a stark contrast to the man who'd once filled it with his presence. He noticed the walls, his brow furrowing. "You painted," he said, almost a question. "Yeah," she replied, pouring him a cup of coffee out of habit, then stopping herself. "Lily's at school. We've got time to sort this out." He nodded, taking a seat at the table. "I've been a mess, Elle. I haven't slept, haven't eaten much. I keep replaying everything, how I hurt you, hurt Lily. I don't know how to make it right." "You can't," she said, sitting across from him. "Not the way it was. But you can decide what you want now. Because I'm not sitting in limbo anymore." He looked down at his hands, twisting the wedding band he still wore. "I ended it with Claire yesterday. It was a mistake, a stupid, selfish mistake. I don't love her, not the way I love you." Her chest tightened, a mix of relief and disbelief. "Then why did you do it? Why wasn't I enough?" "You were," he said, meeting her eyes. "It wasn't about you not being enough. It was me. I got lost, Elle. Work was drowning me, and home felt heavy. Claire was an escape. But I don't want that anymore. I want us." She studied him, searching for the man she'd married beneath the regret. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said finally. "Not after this." "I'll prove it," he said, leaning forward. "Therapy, time, whatever it takes. I'll move out if you need space, but I'm not giving up on us." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She thought of the years they'd shared, the love that had once burned bright, now flickering in the ashes. She thought of Lily, of the family they'd built. And she thought of herself, the woman she'd been, the one she was becoming. "I need time," she said at last. "Not promises. Time to see if there's anything left to save." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I'll wait. As long as it takes." When he left, she didn't cry. She felt lighter, not whole yet, but unburdened. She'd taken back her voice, her choice. That night, she signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something she'd always wanted to try but never had. It was small, but it was hers. Across town, Claire packed her bags. She'd quit the marina that morning, her resignation a single line on a crumpled note. Haven's Edge wasn't her fresh start anymore, it was a chapter she needed to close. She'd seen Daniel's truck leave the motel, his face drawn but resolute, and she knew he'd chosen Eleanor. It stung, but it wasn't a surprise. She'd been a detour, not a destination. She drove north, the sea fading in her rearview mirror, and let the tears come. She'd loved him, or thought she had, but she'd lost herself in the process. Now, she'd find her way back alone, but free. Weeks later, Eleanor stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warm in her hands. The air was crisp, the first hint of spring brushing the coast. Lily ran past, chasing a kite with a friend, her laughter bright against the waves. Daniel was still in the motel, giving her space, but he'd started joining them for Sunday dinners, tentative steps towards something new. Eleanor didn't know if they'd rebuild what they'd had, or if they'd forge something different. But she knew this: she was no longer just his anchor, his wife. She was Eleanor, mother, survivor, a woman carving her own path through the ruins. And that was enough.